That was Michael Anthony, okay? 100% dedicated, never did anything to hurt those guys, and they try to hurt him again and again and again.
There are stories in rock and roll that get told 1,000 times. The legendary riffs, the sold-out arenas, the gold records lining the walls of mansions built on music. But then there are the other stories. The ones whispered backstage. The ones buried under decades of loyalty and silence. The ones that only surface when a man reaches a certain age, looks back at his life, and decides that the truth finally deserves more respect than the peace he kept for so long. Michael Anthony just turned 70 years old. 7 decades of living. Nearly 5 of them spent holding down the low end for one of the greatest rock bands the world has ever seen. And now, with the kind of clarity that only comes with age and distance, he is talking. Really talking. Not the careful, diplomatic answers he gave for years to protect something he loved. Not the deflections or the practiced non-responses. The real story. His story. About loyalty that went unrewarded, about credits that were stolen in plain daylight, about a friendship with Eddie Van Halen that crumbled long before Eddie ever left this earth, and about a betrayal so cold that he didn't even find out about it the way a human being deserves to. He found out on the internet. What you are about to hear is not a story of bitterness. Michael Anthony has never been a bitter man. That is actually part of what makes this so remarkable. This is the story of a man who gave everything to a band, asked for very little in return, and still had that little taken away from him. And at 70, he is finally letting the world understand exactly what happened behind the curtain of Van Halen. To understand what Michael Anthony lost, you first have to understand what he built. He did not arrive in Van Halen as a passenger. He arrived as a craftsman. Growing up in Southern California, raised in a household where music was a living, breathing presence thanks to his father Walter, a trumpet player who performed regularly, Michael absorbed the language of music before he ever picked up an instrument professionally. He started on trumpet himself, marched in the school band at Dana Junior High in Arcadia, and somewhere around the age of 13, the pull of rock music became impossible to resist. The way he got into bass is one of those details that tells you everything about who Michael Anthony is as a person. Most kids wanted to be guitarists. The guitar was the glamour instrument. Everybody wanted to be the one standing at the front of the stage. Michael deliberately chose bass because he wanted to be different. He wanted to occupy a space that mattered without fighting everyone else for it. A friend lent him a Fender Mustang guitar, and rather than play it as intended, Michael removed 2 strings and turned it into a bass. That is not the move of someone who follows the crowd. That is the move of someone who thinks for himself and finds solutions where others only see limitations. His father recognized the talent immediately and invested in a proper instrument, a copy of a Fender Precision bass, along with a Gibson amplifier. With that foundation in place, Michael immersed himself in the work of the players who shaped his sensibility. Jack Bruce of Cream, John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin, Harvey Brooks of the Electric Flag. He practiced with the discipline of someone who understood that the rhythm section is not the background of music. It is the heartbeat. By the early 1970s, he was performing with a local band called Snake, playing the regional circuit around Pasadena and Arcadia, singing lead vocals while holding down the bass. One night, Snake opened for a band called Mammoth at Pasadena High School. Mammoth's PA system failed. Michael offered Snake's equipment without hesitation. That single act of generosity is what connected him to Eddie and Alex Van Halen. Not an audition. Not a phone call. A moment of basic human decency that left an impression. When Mammoth later lost their bassist Mark Stone, the Van Halen brothers remembered the man who had helped them when they had nothing to offer in return. They invited him to a garage jam session, and the chemistry was undeniable. Shortly after, the band changed its name from Mammoth to Van Halen, and Michael Anthony became one of its 4 founding members. Let that word settle. Founding member. Not a hired hand. Not a session player. A founder. Van Halen's debut album arrived in 1978 on Warner Brothers Records, and it hit the music world like a thunderclap. Eddie's guitar playing was instantly hailed as revolutionary, and rightly so. David Lee Roth's frontman energy was impossible to ignore. But inside that sound, holding the entire sonic structure together, was Michael Anthony's bass and his voice. His high-register backing vocals became one of the most recognizable elements of the Van Halen sound. Tracks like Running with the Devil, Ain't Talking About Love, Jamie's Crying, and Feel Your Love Tonight all carry his harmonic fingerprints. Critics praised the blend of power and melody, though the credit rarely landed with Michael's name attached. That pattern would define his entire career with the band. He was essential and invisible at the same time. As the albums stacked up and the tours grew larger, Michael remained the steady center of a band that was frequently anything but steady. Internal tensions were a near-constant presence in Van Halen's world, driven by clashing egos, alcohol, and the pressure of maintaining a commercial empire built on explosive personalities. Through all of it, Michael was the one who showed up, played his part, sang his harmonies, and kept his mouth shut. Early in the band's run, the financial arrangements were equal. All four members shared in the revenues and the debts. According to former manager Noel Monk, Michael held a legitimate 20% stake in the band's finances and participated in business decisions like a full partner. That was what he had been promised. That was what he had earned. That was also, ultimately, what was taken from him. By 1984, Van Halen had scaled heights that most rock bands only dream about. The album titled 1984 was a commercial juggernaut, featuring Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher. It would go on to sell over 10 million copies in the United States alone. For Michael Anthony, it should have been the crowning moment of a career defined by dedication. Instead, it became the site of one of the most quietly devastating betrayals in rock history. According to former manager Noel Monk, who detailed the incident in his memoir, Michael was presented with a contract backstage just hours before a live performance. The document required him to sign away all future songwriting credits and royalties. Not just going forward. Retroactively. Including the album he had just helped create. The album that was already selling millions of copies. And when he sat down to face that document, all three of his bandmates were standing over him. Eddie Van Halen. Alex Van Halen. David Lee Roth. 3 against 1. Hours before he had to walk onto a stage and perform for thousands of people. He signed it. He has said in later interviews that he signed because he wanted to keep the band together. Because playing music was what he loved more than anything, and he was terrified of losing access to it. Because the pressure in that room was not subtle or patient. It was immediate and suffocating. Michael Anthony signed under conditions that any reasonable person would describe as coercion, and in doing so, he forfeited millions of dollars in future earnings from licensing deals, greatest hits compilations, reissues, and every commercial use of songs he helped bring to life. For years, he said nothing publicly. He maintained professionalism. He kept touring and recording. He held his silence with the same quiet discipline he brought to the bass. But the damage was done, and the imbalance it created left him permanently vulnerable to whatever came next. What came next was a slow and deliberate erosion of Michael's reputation, conducted largely in public by Eddie Van Halen himself. In the years following the band's commercial peak, as internal relationships deteriorated and personal demons took a heavier toll on those involved, Eddie began making comments in interviews that cast doubt on Michael's musical abilities. The remarks started small and grew more pointed over time. The most damaging came in a 2015 Billboard interview, where Eddie claimed he had to personally show Michael every note he ever played, essentially painting his bandmate of decades as a dependent, passive musician who contributed nothing of his own initiative. The reaction from fans and fellow musicians was immediate and forceful. People who had watched Michael perform for 30 years, who had heard the harmonies and felt the groove, knew those statements did not match reality. Michael himself responded with measured but firm clarity. He stated that he had always learned the band's material independently. He pointed out that if such teaching sessions had ever taken place, some evidence of them would exist somewhere in the decades of documentation surrounding Van Halen. None did. His position was not that Eddie was misremembering. His position was that the claims were simply not true. But the damage of public statements operates on its own timeline. Doubt, once planted, takes root. For a period, new fans encountering those quotes had reason to question a legacy that Michael had spent his entire adult life building. The man who had been the invisible pillar was now also the man being publicly questioned by the face of the band he co-founded. Michael described the experience as emotionally devastating. Not because of the professional implications, but because this was someone he had known and worked alongside since they were young men playing garages and high school gymnasiums in Southern California. The personal wound was deeper than any financial one. By the mid-2000s, the relationship between Michael and the Van Halen brothers had effectively collapsed. Communication had dwindled to almost nothing. In 2004, when the band reunited with Sammy Hagar for a tour, Michael was allowed to participate only after agreeing to reduced financial compensation and a contract that classified him not as a band member but as a hired performer. He accepted those terms because, again, he wanted to play. Because the music still mattered to him even when the people around it had stopped treating him accordingly. That 2004 tour was his last. But he did not find that out through a phone call. He did not receive a conversation or a meeting. He found out, as he later revealed publicly, through the internet. Through fan forums and rumors and online speculation that eventually crystallized into confirmed fact, Eddie Van Halen had decided to replace him with his own teenage son, Wolfgang Van Halen. Think about what that means for a moment. A man who had been a founding member of Van Halen for over 3 decades. Who had played on every album, sung on every tour, held the band's sound together through lineup changes and personal crises and industry shifts. That man did not receive a phone call telling him his time with the band was over. He read about his own dismissal online,